Well, here we all are, home, with all our careful plans for celebrating the 19th Amendment thrown into chaos. This isn't the first time. I recently ran across this photo of women in 1918 wearing masks during the Great Flu epidemic, which lasted until December of 1920. 100 years ago, Carrie Chapman Catt was home recovering from the flu. All her careful plans for the campaign to ratify the 19th were out the window. She was still recovering when she made the journey to Nashville for that final epic battle. Well, here's to the women on whose strong shoulders we stand. I come to you from Washington State, so you'll see an emphasis on the women of the West, and you'll see how our stories came together in Tennessee. Now, there will be songs. You'll see some lyrics on your screen, and you don't have to be shy about singing along. History books give us historical facts of soldiers and sailors and men with their axes, but who filled their bellies, who washed their clothes, who raised up the children, who nurtured their souls. Without all the women, now where would we be? Working and caring throughout history. Their hands on the plow, but their stories untold. Here's to the women who shouldered the load. You're about to meet women whose names may be familiar and women whose names we may never know, but whose stories are very important in shaping who we are as women as we struggle to find our voices. The wilderness held you in the palm of her hand. It took more than muscle to settle this land. Women together set straight to the task, with schools and libraries, a city at last. Without all the women, now where would we be? Working and caring throughout history. Their hands on the plow, but their stories untold. Here's to the women who shouldered the load. Women's lives and stories. Women's work was not considered very important in the history books that I grew up with. History tended to be counted from war to war. Yet it was the work of the women that often fed and clothed the families and created communities that were vital to the very survival of the families. So the women came west, some willingly, some not so much, and other women were here to greet them when they came. Some came here from Mexico, Norway, Japan, to raise the good crops in this faraway land. Some came as picture brides, so little choice. Some came as slaves with no hope and no voice. Now, weaving through the threads of women's experience are both the raising up and the silencing of their voices, because one cannot truly understand the importance of the struggle for women to find their voices without understanding the deep silencing of their experience. And central to this is the struggle for finding a voice through the ballot. And what a struggle it was! But thanks to the work of generations of women, women of Washington won the vote in 1910. Idaho in 1896, Oregon in 1912, California in 1911, and Montana in 1914, years before it was passed nationally. Some women grew tired of having no say, so they listened to Abigail, Emma, and May. For 50 long years they fought for the vote, so their daughters could enter the future with hope. Now, when you think about how you know about the women who've gone before, I'd say it's highly likely that you know about them by exploring sources that traditional historians would likely have missed. Women's stories are found in old photograph albums, in crafts, basket weaving, and quilting, in recipes, in letters and diaries, and in songs and poems. And central to their experience was the valuing of relationships. In hard times and good times, the women would share their songs and their stories, their loves and their fears, and their histories recorded. The song never ends in the memories of mothers and sisters and friends. Without all the women, now where would we be? Working and caring throughout history. Their hands on the plow, but their stories untold. Here's to the women who shouldered the load, and here's to the women who shouldered the load. One of the earliest women to advocate for women's rights in U.S. history was Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, who wrote to him to remember the ladies in a letter to him in France as he worked on the founding documents of this new country in 1776. She said, "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Sacagawea, a member of the Shoshone tribe, was one of the first women to vote as a highly respected member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. You can find that in their journals, as she guided them on their journey in 1804 through 1806. Her contribution was beyond measure, and she did it all with a baby on her back. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, adopted Sacagawea as a symbol for women's rights. These early women, both native and immigrants, created beautiful art in the intricate and functional quilts and baskets they made, even though their lives were very difficult. Native women made baskets for gathering food and for cooking, baskets woven so tightly that they held water. There were patterns that were passed down from mother to daughter. In my Anglo tradition, there were also quilt patterns passed down from mother to daughter. Our foremothers created quilts from whatever fabric they could find. My grandmother's hands wove the cedar and bear grass into this fine basket I hold in my hands to hold bitter roots, camas fern, tiger lily, blackberries, cranberries, gifts from the land. My great-grandma Towsley passed on her knowledge to her daughter Sally. She was only 6 then. Our tribe's own design, such as Salmon Hill, trail of eel, flowers for women and deer for the men. My grandmother's hands worked with bright colored fabric, taken from dresses I wore long ago, with strong cotton thread and the finest of needles, weaving my memories in patterns she'd sew. My great-grandma Eleanor passed on her knowledge to her daughter Susan when she was just 9. Lone Star Log Cabin, the sweet rose of Sharon, basket, medallion, her favorite designs. Salmon gill, trail of eel, flowers and deer, bringing the lives of our ancestors our log cabin basket design, weaving and quilting our stories entwine, weaving and quilting our stories entwine. I mentioned diaries as one way that women's voices can be heard. At a time when women had few rights and choices about their lives, Mary Richardson Walker wrote about her life in her diary. I think these writings give us some vivid insights into what it may have been like to be a woman in the early 1800s. Here's a note she wrote on the wagon train journey headed to Oregon Territory as a newly married, pregnant young missionary. Should feel much better if Mr. W. would only treat me with some cordiality. It is so hard to please him, I almost despair of ever being able to. That was written on April 24th, 1838. Here's another note from Mary's diary in 1842. Rose about 5, had early breakfast, got my housework done about 9, baked 6 loaves of bread, made a kettle of mush, and have now suet pudding and beef boiling. I have managed to put my clothes away and set my house in order. At 9:00 p.m. was delivered of another son. Of course, women of the time had very few rights and very little voice. In the 1970s, I interviewed a 100-year-old woman near Centralia and asked her what her life had been like. She leaned forward and angrily said, "We were chattel." Women could not own property. Indeed, they were considered property. Now, on the national scene, women met together in 1848 for the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, an unprecedented gathering of women raising their voices. Public speaking for women was very rare indeed, and to be advocating for reforms or for their rights was highly unusual. Many of the women had to be convinced to go beyond advocating for reforms and to go for the vote. They were very reluctant until a man the women greatly respected stood and gave a passionate speech and swayed the women to go for suffrage. That man was Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist that the women supported and who now supported them as they petitioned for their rights. Two women who were also active in both the abolitionist and women's rights causes and spoke passionately about both were Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. Sojourner famously said, "If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, and the men better let them." It was Harriet Tubman who said, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." In 1871, almost a quarter century after Seneca Falls, Oregon's Abigail Scott Duniway, editor of the New Northwest, and Susan B. Anthony toured the Northwest, working for the vote and influencing a new generation of women. Washington State went through a whole series of votes granting women the vote, then taking it away over the next 5 decades. Now, this is the chorus of a song I wrote about that struggle that could still be relevant today. They'll vote us up, they'll vote us down, they'll give us the runaround, they'll give it and they'll take away, but we will have our say and we will have our day. They'll vote us up, they'll vote us down, they'll give us the runaround, they'll give it and they'll take away, but we will have our say and we will have our day. By the late 1800s, after having their vote taken away yet again, Washington's women became very discouraged and their activism lessened. It was during this time, in the late 1890s, that an event happened that illustrates again the tragic silencing of women of the time. A Spokane woman named Helga took a historic walk across the country, an event that was lost to history for almost 100 years, until a few articles saved from a burning bin brought her story to light. Helga was offered money, enough money to save the family farm that was about to be seized for taxes, if she would walk across the country. So she agreed, in part because she was an active suffragist and wanted to prove the fortitude of women. She took her 19-year-old daughter Clara with her, leaving behind her other children and her husband. If you can imagine taking that walk in long skirts and later the new bicycle skirt, in thin leather shoes, mostly on railroad tracks, it was an amazing accomplishment, but it came with a high cost. I'll never forget the first time I saw her, she and her daughter just outside Spokane in her high-button shoes, a gun on her shoulder, setting off on a wager to walk across the land. Helga and her husband were hard-working farmers, but the year of 1896 brought them to their knees. The old they had been crippled. Helga's health was fading. If they didn't pay their taxes soon, the farm would be seized. Then Helga had an offer from secret New York sponsors to earn $10,000 to walk across the land. So one clear May morn, with winter frost still forming, they set off on the railroad tracks east of Spokane. We are all on a journey, and who can know the end? Hidden in the promises scattered by the wind. But she walked across this country, it was all that she could do. Helga S.P. of Spokane, we will remember you. Near the end of the journey, Clara sprained her ankle, but they made it to New York on a cold December day. Sponsors were sorry, but they never paid a penny. They'd walked 4,000 miles, but they got there 3 days late. In May they returned to a heartbroken family, 2 children they'd buried, the farm would be lost. In their grief and anger, they hid the walk in silence, too bitter the memory, too high was the cost. Many years later, in 1920, in a small Spokane attic, old Helga sorted her notes. She locked the door tightly, but her mind still could journey. She picked up her pen and she secretly wrote. And the years fell away. She wrote of the people, the beauty of the desert, with Clara by her side. But when she died, her daughters burned every paper, but her memory was stronger, her story survived. We are all on a journey, and who can know the end? Hidden in the promises scattered by the wind. But she walked across this country, it was all that she could do. Helga S.P. of Spokane, we will remember you. Helga S.P. of Spokane, we will remember you. Author Linda Hunt has a wonderful book out called Bold Spirit, in which she talks about the walk in the context of the silencing of family stories. Women of that time just weren't supposed to leave their families, even though she took the walk to try to save the family farm. It just wasn't done. and she paid for her boldness for the rest of her life. There are now 2 more books about this walk, The Year We Were Famous, written by Helga's great-granddaughter, and The Daughter's Walk by Jane Kirkpatrick. In the early 1900s, women became energized to work for the vote again in Washington due to the efforts of 2 women, Emma Smith DeVoe and May Arkwright Hutton. Emma Smith DeVoe moved to Tacoma to invigorate the suffrage movement in Washington state. She was inspired as a young woman by Susan B. Anthony. She was a middle-class woman, a paid organizer. She believed the most effective means was to work quietly, behind the scenes, having teas for the legislators' wives. This was known as the still hunt method. Now, May Arkwright Hutton of Spokane was a very different kind of woman. May ran a boarding house in Idaho where she was an active suffragist, union supporter, and silver miner. She was a working-class woman, an outstanding speaker. She was also known to smoke cigars and cuss on occasion. Some referred to her as the battle axe of the Coeur d'Alenes. In 1906, after she and her husband struck it rich, they moved to Spokane, where she lost the vote she had worked so hard to obtain in Idaho. Now, May was a rough-hewn, large woman who loved publicity. When it came time to lobby the legislators, she took a bevy of beauties to Olympia using a more direct, let's say a frontal approach. These 2 women did not get along. In fact, Emma's secretary sent a note to May saying, "You are not eligible for membership in the Washington Equal Suffrage Association because of your coarse language and questionable past." Now, if there was ever a setup for a song, this was it. Feel free to join in with hoops and hollers, you'll know when. Emma Smith DeVoe was a lady of no small acclaim. Her name was synonymous with grace and gentility. Emma Smith DeVoe was a leader of wit and of charm. Her style was disarmingly steeped in civility. Then there was May, May, May Arkwright Hutton from the east side of the mountains with a passion for a fight. May, May, bigger than an army, hats and furs and feathers, lordy mercy, what a sight. Emma Smith DeVoe was a slow, thoughtful lady whose style was to smile as she lobbied for women's equality. Emma came from the east to Tacoma in 1906, and she organized women to fight but act womanly. Then there was May, May, May Arkwright Hutton, rags to riches lady, made a fortune in the mines. May, May, loud and bold and brassy, impudent and sassy, never one to toe the line. Emma and May, how they argued and lobbied and fought. Each thought that the other's defeat would bring victory. It still goes on today, some fly high and as bright as a kite, but the strings held by those on the earth planted solidly. Women like May, May Arkwright Hutton, wild and strong and common as our passion to be free. Women like Emma, graceful, bright and cultured. We all need each other to achieve equality. Oh, we all need each other to achieve equality. Well, we now know that the coalition between working class women, shop girls, mill workers, waitresses, union women, and their more affluent middle and upper class sisters was vital to the success of suffrage. One example is Rose Schneiderman, Jewish organizer with the Garment Workers Union and the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women and fiery suffrage speaker. She told her audience, "What the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist. The right to life as the rich woman has the right to life, and the sun and music and art. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. Help, you women of privilege, give her the ballot to fight with." Now, at this time in history, women were considered less intelligent than men, less able physically for the rigors of politics and business, and by nature subordinate to men. In answer, poet and suffragist Alice Duer Miller wrote in 1915, "Why we oppose votes for men. 1. Because man's place is in the army. 2. Because no really manly man wants to settle any question otherwise than by fighting about it. 3. Because if men should adopt peaceable methods, women will no longer look up to them. 4. Because men will lose their charm if they step out of their natural sphere and interest themselves in other matters than feats of arms, uniforms, and drums. 5. Because men are too emotional to vote. Their conduct at baseball games and political conventions shows this, while their innate tendency to appeal to force renders them particularly unfit for the task of government. So while women were busy challenging cultural assumptions, they also sought to prove that they were equal, yet still good housewives and mothers, as you can see depicted in this cartoon. Women suffragists busy peeling potatoes when not getting votes. In 1909, women across the state of Washington worked to put together the Washington Women's Cookbook to sell at the Alaska-Yukon exhibition and to promote their cause, because cookbooks then and now are great fundraisers. There was a national as well as many local suffrage cookbooks. This is a good cookbook, although some of these recipes may sound a bit strange to our ears today. I challenged myself to put together a song with this cookbook's recipe names. Bubble and squeak, pickle-lily, bubble and squeak, vinegar pie, bubble and squeak, beet pickle chow chow, serve it up for women's rights. Clam chowder, clam croquettes, clam fritter, clam puree, oyster omelets, oyster cocktails, scalloped oysters, if you please, Hungarian stew, German pancakes, Turkish cream, Egyptian rice, Welsh rarebit, Yorkshire pudding. We are made of sugar and spice. Bubble and squeak, pickle-lily, bubble and squeak, vinegar pie, bubble and squeak, beet pickle chow chow, serve it up for women's rights. Toast and wallops, rainbow trout, try Puyallup, cauliflower, Yakima, tomato soup, women's votes for women's power, hardtack pudding, suet pudding, devil's food, divinity, snowball donut, lightning cake, women's votes will set us free. Bubble and squeak, pickle-lily, bubble and squeak, vinegar pie, bubble and squeak, beet pickle chow chow, serve it up for women's rights. Breast meat, mince meat, boiled tongue, beef brawn, seabird, shark tails, lutefisk, Mrs. Oakley, sheep tongue, Spanish, peep, old ladies, take some risks, Miss Whelan's peanut candy, Mrs. Johnson's Johnny cake, Mrs. Wardall's prison fare. What a world we will create. Bubble and squeak, pickle-lily, bubble and squeak, vinegar pie, bubble and squeak, beet pickle chow chow, serve it up for women's rights, serve it up for women's rights. Although it is now clear that all women did not get the vote 100 years ago. Many of the women who were disenfranchised made a tremendous contribution to the struggle. Here's an image of two prominent Chinese suffragists, Emma Tom Lung and Clara Lee, voting in California in 1911. However, in many places, Asian women could not vote until well into the 50s. Three of the leading suffragists in the U.S., Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Matilda Joslyn Gage, and Lucretia Mott, were inspired in their writings by the matrilineal culture of the Haudenosaunee. The equality in all aspects of tribal life offered a vision of freedom that the suffragists adopted. Yet when the vote was finally won, many Native women could not vote until 1924, and for some, it was 1962. The suffrage movement in New Mexico was largely driven by the Latino women using corridos, powerful songs and stories, and gatherings in front of the homes of powerful male legislators to convince them to pass the vote. Among the most influential was Nina Otero Warren. In Washington state, women finally won the vote in 1910 after 50 years of struggle. We were the 5th state in the Union to do so. But on the national scene, the battle for the 19th Amendment granting universal suffrage to American women was heating up. Young suffragists Alice Paul and Lucy Byrne were growing impatient with the state-by-state method favored by the National American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt. Think of Alice and Carrie a little like Emma and May. They did not get along. Alice and Lucy eventually formed the National Woman's Party. Their method was to organize mass meetings and huge parades. The 1913 parade in Washington, D.C. drew 5,000 and included 20 floats, 9 bands, and 4 mounted brigades. The 1915 parade in New York drew 20,000. Here are some of the Northwest women gathering for a parade. Inez Milholland was a labor lawyer, passionate speaker, World War I protester who led the parades on a horse. Despite an illness, she went on a speaking tour in the West and collapsed while giving a speech in Los Angeles. She died 10 weeks later, November 25, 1916. She was known as the martyr of the suffrage cause. There's a book and film that are excellent windows into the life of this remarkable woman. I wrote this song from the perspective of a woman marching in one of these parades. If you had seen Inez riding on her white horse, if you had seen Inez so beautiful and proud, perhaps you'd understand and feel what I feel. We would have walked through fire if you had seen Inez. If you had seen Inez, starry crown, so like a queen, her blue cloak wrapped around her. I see her in my dreams. We march shoulder to shoulder, our banner flying high. Inez would ride before us. How I would smile when she went by. Votes for women, she would cry. Votes for women, we replied. How our hearts were filled with pride. I still cannot believe she died. You had seen Inez, her lovely body gaunt and pale. If you had seen her struggle to say again, we cannot fail. then she crumpled like a white rose, like petals soft and scattered. Perhaps you'd understand our sorrow. To carry on was all that mattered. Votes for women, she would cry. Votes for women, we replied. How our hearts were filled with pride. And I still cannot believe she died. If you had seen Inez, if you had seen Inez. In the 1913 parade in Washington, D.C., the black suffragists were told to march at the end of the parade so as not to offend the Southern suffragists who refused to march with the black women. But Ida B. Wells Barnett, black journalist and anti-lynching activist, refused to go to the back of the bus, stepped in from the sidelines to march with her Chicago sister suffragists. Mary Church Terrell, born in Memphis, was one of the first African-American women to earn a college degree, yet she too faced discrimination within the suffrage movement. She actively campaigned for black women's suffrage, picketing the White House with the National Woman's Party. She was a lifelong friend of Susan B. Anthony. Her words, "Lifting as we climb," became the motto of the National Association of Colored Women, the group she helped found in 1896. When suffrage was finally passed, many African American women still were denied the vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For 2 years, every day but Sunday, members of the National Woman's Party stood before the White House as silent sentinels, holding banners demanding President Wilson to give them the vote. At the outbreak of World War I in 1917, violence erupted and the women were attacked. Yet it was the women who were arrested and sent to the notorious Occoquan workhouse. For suffragists, their role in World War I was vital in their arguments they felt for the vote. It was an opportunity for the women to show their abilities, intelligence, and patriotism. But the suffragists were split in their decision to cooperate with the need for workers to join the war effort. Some suffragists chose to continue the White House picketing and to work for the suffrage cause. And that was the reason for the anger and attacks that led to the women picketers being imprisoned. Here's a song the women sang in the prison. The SBA is the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, the 19th Amendment. Zinkum was the jail warden. We've been starving in the workhouse all the livelong day. We've been starving in the workhouse just to pass the SBA. Don't you hear old Zinkum calling? Rise up so early in the morn. Don't you see the Senate moving? Woodrow, blow your horn. In the prison, women staged hunger strikes. They were force-fed with tubes forced down their noses and their throats. Then on the night of November 15th, 1917, the women were attacked by 40 guards with the warden's blessing, beaten, kicked, choked, pinched, slammed against the wall. It became known as the Night of Terror. The treatment of the women raised such a public outcry that the women were released. Alice Paul presented each of the 149 women who went to jail a pin like this one in a special ceremony. The SBA amendment gained momentum and was passed by a landslide in 1919, and then the ratification process began. In order for the 19th Amendment to become a constitutional right, 36 states had to ratify it. Tennessee was in the eyes of the nation as the pro-suffrage and the anti-suffragist forces gathered at the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville, blocks from the state capitol, to plan their campaigns. The fate of the amendment was at stake, and everyone knew it. Here was Carrie Chapman Catt, leader of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Here also was Sue Sheldon White, representing the more progressive group, the National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul. And here was Josephine A. Pearson of the Tennessee State Association, opposed to woman suffrage, fearing that the vote would lead to the breakdown of the family order and that woman suffrage would empower more African Americans. The vote had to be ratified by men, and the vote was evenly split. It was dubbed the War of the Roses. Those who were for giving women the vote wore yellow roses. Those planning to vote against it wore red roses. The deciding vote came down to 24-year-old Mr. Harry Byrne, the youngest member of the House of Representatives in Tennessee. On that day, on August 18, 1920, Harry was wearing a red rose. But after receiving a letter from his mother, he threw down the red rose and cast the deciding vote to ratify. After the vote, he was chased by the antis around the chambers, climbed out a window, and had to hide in the attic of the state capitol building. Thank you, Mr. Douglas. You stood up straight and tall. Your words touched hearts and minds. You swayed the vote at Seneca Falls. The women stood beside you till all the slaves were free. And you stood for women's rights and her equality. And you stood for women's rights and her equality. Thank you, Mr. Harry Byrne. Hurrah, you passed the test. You listened to your mother, changed your mind and voted yes. She said, hurrah for suffrage, I'm watching where you stand. So be a good boy, Harry, and give Mrs. Can a hand. Be a good boy, Harry, and give Mrs. Can a hand. There's a great book about the Tennessee battle called The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss that I highly recommend. I mentioned before the importance of the women who joined the workforce during World War I and their fight for equality. This was equally true for women during World War II, women who were still fighting for justice in the home and workplace. And they were encouraged again to take the place of the men who went off to war. They were dubbed Rosie the Riveters. My mom was one. Here she is. She drove a truck at what was then Camp Lewis. During this era, all of the magazines made it clear women who worked outside of the home were not really good mothers and wives. My mom has talked about how difficult it was for her to be scorned by other women for being a working mother, but she, like so many others, had little choice. Here's a reading from an oral history interview from a woman who worked at Boeing during World War II. The day the war ended, every woman in there got it. Lead man came round and said, Frances, tonight you can hang your torch up. Your job's done. The war is over. And on that day, I picked up a piece of scrap iron and lit my torch and wrote my name on it. That was in 1945. This is my proof for my grandchildren and great-grandchildren that I really was a burner in the wartime. I don't know this particular woman's story. I did create a song out of many stories that I heard. My strong right arm built the ship that sailed to war. My strong right arm built the ship, and what was that all for? In 1941, the war had just begun. Jim was so young, but soon was off to hold a gun. I was 19, our child was only 3, when the paper said the shipyards needed me. I moved to Bremerton in 1942. I learned to weld. I was the best one on our crew. The work was hard. The heat would burn my lungs all day, but when the paycheck came, we girls would feel okay. In 1943, in August, 8 a.m., I'd not been sleeping well. My mind was filled with Jim. There was a knock. A man in uniform stood there. He said my Jim was dead. I hadn't seen him in 2 years. In 1945, the war came to an end. And on that very day, the big boss, he came in. He smiled and said, "My girls, the boys are coming home. You've earned a rest. Go home. Your work here now is done." Picked up a scrap of metal, and I carved my name full bore, so my child would know I was a welder in the war. No place to go. I was a widow with a child, so I waitressed and I cooked, and I married in a while. Sometimes I see that scrap with my name carved in so deep, and I recall the day the boss told me to leave, how I felt like some old rag they tossed aside, as useless as my patriotic pride. My strong right arm built the ship that sailed to war. My strong right arm built the ship, and what was that all for? So have women today found their voices? I'd say some women have. The 2018 election brought us the most diverse Congress in history, with 23 women in the Senate, 102 women in the House. And we now have Nancy Pelosi for a second term as Speaker of the House. But the U.S. still ranks 104th among developed countries in the number of women serving in government. And women still earn 80.5 cents to every dollar a man doing similar work earns. Your vote is a precious gift from your ancestors, hard-won. It took 72 years. Those who began the movement at Seneca Falls did not live to see it pass. Today, as the early suffragists warned, eternal vigilance is crucial to retain our democracy. Across the country, there still remain many barriers to the vote. Laws restricting voter registration campaigns and voter ID laws that hurt the ability of college students, the elderly, people of color to vote. There are failed voting machines, closed polling stations, incredibly long lines, and barriers to mail-in ballots in this era of a pandemic. So there's work to be done. I'll close today with a song in honor of the women who've come before and the women who will come after. And later, I encourage you to have a conversation with someone about women you know who have gone before. Do you have any stories about women who have inspired you, women who raised you? Let's share those stories, and please vote. It is up to every one of us to use our voices to determine how our government works. Seasons come and seasons go to learn the things that women know. Plant the seeds and tend the land, working hearts and working hands. If seeds are scattered to the wind like broken hearts who might have pins, daughters plant them once again. Many generations, many generations. Grandma held a burning light, read her Bible every night, found the faith to carry on with sons and husband dead and gone. In my darkest times I see Grandma's light enfolding me. Though her faith's a different hue, Grandma, I remember you. Many generations, many My mother takes her own sweet time, drinks her days like vintage wine. In the kitchen I can hear her voice is rising sweet and clear. Raised her kids and worked too hard, planted roses in our yard. In the fall she pruned them back, kids and roses needed that. Many generations, many generations. Now my daughters make their way, I smile to hear the things they say. So many seeds I tried to plant, nurtured now in their strong hands. Fingers dance on their guitars, songs as true as shooting stars. Grandma's light is burning still, I believe it always will. Many generations, many generations, many generations, many generations. God, this is such a hard song to sing.
Love it.
Too many words, too many words. Shoot the songwriter.